Never understood why my family was so insistent. My sister had fallen ill for a long time, and during her time bedridden, Daniel had stood by her side, unwavering. But as her condition worsened, so did her ability to carry on with the wedding plans. My family, in an attempt to hold on to tradition and keep things intact, convinced me to step in and marry Daniel instead. They told me it was the only way to save face, to keep things together. I was reluctant, but the pressure was too much to bear. My heart sank as I stepped into the church, dressed in a gown meant for my sister, standing before Daniel, who was sitting in a wheelchair. The room was filled with a bittersweet sadness. He smiled at me weakly, and though his eyes were filled with sorrow, there was a strange sense of acceptance in them. Just as the ceremony began and I started to speak my vows, something extraordinary happened. Daniel's hands, which had been trembling on the arms of the chair, slowly began to grip the edges. Then, with a groan and an effort that made the room hold its breath, he pushed himself up. The wheelchair fell backward as Daniel stood before me, no longer crippled by the disease that had held him down for so long. His legs, which had been weak, now supported his full weight. The gasps in the room were audible as he took a slow step forward, his eyes locked with mine. "Surprise," he whispered. I felt my heart stop for a moment. Everything I thought I knew had shattered. My family, stunned into silence, watched in disbelief. He was no longer the man I had seen as fragile and broken. He was a man standing on his own, ready to take control of his life again, no longer bound by the chains of pity or expectation. The wedding, once a mere formality to keep the peace, had now turned into something entirely different. I no longer had to pretend, and neither did he. We both realized that we had been forced into a story that wasn't ours to tell. The only thing left to do was to make our own choices. The moment he stood up was nothing short of a revelation. My mind raced as I tried to process what had just happened. Daniel, once the man I thought was broken and bound to a wheelchair, now stood before me, his posture straight, his face filled with a mix of triumph and something I couldn't quite grasp. The room was still, save for the soft echo of his first step toward me. I blinked, and then it hit me, the realization that everything up until that point had been a lie. Not just the marriage my family had coerced me into, but the very image of Daniel as a helpless man, bound by his own limitations. But then, before I could even gather my thoughts, he said it. "Iktu." The word hung in the air like a weight, a word I had never heard before. My confusion deepened as I wondered if it was some kind of joke, or perhaps a foreign term, an inside joke he'd never shared. I could see the tension building in his shoulders, like he was preparing for something more. "Iktu," he repeated, this time with more emphasis, his voice steady and strong. I stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. And then, in a moment of clarity, I realized Iktu wasn't just a word. It was the truth. It was the moment everything changed. It wasn't just about him standing up. It was about his choice, his decision to rise above what had been expected of him. Iktu was Latin, meaning at that moment, and it was as though he was marking the instant when everything shifted, when the past no longer had control over the present. The word was his declaration that he was no longer the man in the wheelchair, but someone entirely new, someone who refused to live by the limits others had set for him. And in that moment, I knew that the life I thought I was walking into, one of duty and expectation, was now something I had to choose for myself. The wedding, my family's insistence, the role I was supposed to play, it all felt irrelevant in the face of this new truth. This was Daniel's moment, and he was claiming it. He turned to me with a gaze that was clear, no longer clouded by the self-doubt I had once seen in him. The power dynamic had shifted. This wasn't about a forced marriage anymore. This was about our choices. I looked back at him, and the weight of Iktu hung in the air. It was the moment we both stepped into the unknown, free to choose our own paths. As Daniel stood before me, the word Iktum echoed in the silence. I had never heard him use it before, nor did I know its meaning. His eyes locked with mine, and there was something almost magnetic in his gaze. It wasn't just about him standing up. It was the weight of that single word, the gravity it carried. "Ik too," he repeated, this time more firmly, his voice steady, as if it were a command or a declaration. I could feel the tension in the room rise, everyone waiting for some kind of explanation. But instead, Daniel took another step toward me, and my confusion deepened. The word wasn't just an unfamiliar term, it was a marker of a moment. At that instant, the realization of what had been concealed for so long. I began to piece it together. That "ik too" wasn't merely an exclamation, it was the point of no return. It was the declaration that everything had changed, that all the assumptions and expectations were gone. "Ik too," he said again, this time in a softer tone, but it was as if the word carried the weight of years. It was the moment he had taken back his agency, standing on his own after all this time. It was his liberation, and now it was my turn to choose my path too. In that moment, the world seemed to pause. My family stood in stunned silence, unsure of how to react to the reality that Daniel was no longer the man I had been forced to marry. He was a different version of himself, one free from the constraints we had all placed upon him. And I, too, was now at a crossroads. I felt my heart race, the word almost hanging between us like an invisible thread. It wasn't just a word. It was a signal, a turning point. I could see it in his eyes, the clarity, the strength that hadn't been there before. And then it clicked. "Ik too," in Latin, meant at that moment. The word was an undeniable marker, an instantaneous realization. It wasn't just that he stood up. He was declaring this moment as his own, as if to say, this was the moment he decided to live for himself, to stand on his own terms, to rewrite the script that had been written for him. The silence stretched, and I realized this was his declaration of independence, and in a way, it was mine too. The life my family had tried to impose on me, the forced union, the expectations, they all felt distant, irrelevant now. He took another step toward me, and suddenly the weight of what was happening settled in. No longer was I bound by the promise I had been coerced into. Neither was he. "Ik too," he whispered again, and it was clear that his struggle was not just physical, but emotional. He had fought, not just against his body, but against the role he had been cast into, against the perception of weakness. He was no longer the man in the wheelchair. He was the man who had risen. And I was standing there, on the edge of a moment I could not undo, but could choose to navigate however I wished. The room was holding its breath, waiting for a reaction. My family's confusion mirrored my own, but in that silence, I knew that we had all crossed a threshold. Daniel was no longer someone to pity. He was someone who had taken control of his destiny.